Hello, my name is Brian Daniels, and I'm an assistant professor in the school psychology program at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. And today I'm here to talk about various screening approaches available to you to assess students' social emotional skills and behavior. I'd like to recognize a couple of our graduate students, Danielle Fowler and Patrick Robinson Link, who helped with this particular module, as well as the Birch Project leadership, Melissa Perot at the University of Massachusetts, Boston, and Sarah Whitcomb at UMass Amherst. The purpose of this module is really to give you an idea of the various screening approaches available to you, as well as some important considerations for evaluating those various screening approaches. So let's get started. The mission of the Birch Project is to provide professional development and resources to schools to strengthen the coordination of their behavioral health supports, as well as coordination with outside community agencies. You can find more information about the Birch Project at umb.edu/birch. Many of you are considering whether or not to conduct social, emotional, and behavioral screening. I can tell you that it's important because many of the students that we work with have symptoms or behaviors that would qualify them for a psychiatric diagnosis over the course of their lifetime. Approximately 1 in 5, or 20% of children and adolescents, experience these symptoms. The problem is that many of these students do not receive treatment. One of the reasons they are not identified to receive treatment is that we do not have a systematic process for identifying them and their needs. Social emotional behavioral screening can help us identify these students and maximize our awareness of their needs without waiting for them to exhibit problems. We can be proactive and identify them before problems become entrenched. A systematic process for SEB screening can also help us identify risk across a wide range of problems or skill areas without relying on methods that can be highly subjective. Relying on teachers to nominate students or using some existing data sources have the potential to identify students who predominantly exhibit externalizing behavior problems. However, we know that there are many other types of social and emotional problems that may interfere with student learning. So using a systematic process to identify students and their areas of need helps us maximize our approach to intervention. Before I get into specific screening approaches, there's a number of important considerations to think about when deciding on SEB screening procedures. Glover and Albers identified 3 main areas for consideration when evaluating screening tools: appropriateness, technical adequacy, and usability. The extent to which a screening tool is appropriate refers to the fact that it is compatible with local service delivery needs. We have the infrastructure to be able to use this particular screening tool. The constructs or the behaviors assessed by a particular screening tool are those that we care about. So there are a number of screening tools that assess problem behaviors. There are also screening tools that assess strengths or social competence. So it depends on what our school community is interested in assessing, which determines the extent to which a screening tool is a good fit for us. We also need to consider the extent to which a screening tool fits our target population. So this may refer to race and ethnicity, but it also refers to age. There are screening tools that have been developed for preschool students exclusively. There are screening tools that have been developed for elementary students, and there are those that span the full range of K to 12. So it's important to consider to what extent this screening tool is appropriate for our context and our population based on the constructs that we care about. Next, technical adequacy refers to the extent to which a screening tool has evidence to support that it's reliable, valid, and has accurate classification with regard to identifying students who have problems or those who do not. So many of the screening tools available on the commercial market have adequate technical adequacy. Finally, we need to consider the extent to which a SEB screening tool is usable. And by usable, we mean that we can turn those results into action. The screening tool can be used in a feasible way and that it doesn't overburden our staff. It's acceptable to teachers and school staff. Teachers and school staff would feel that it's acceptable for them to use certain procedures like completing rating scales or whatever is involved in the screening process. Also, we have to consider whether the costs of this particular screening tool in terms of money as well as time spent completing the screening procedures outweigh the benefits. Ideally, we are maximizing the benefit of the screening process so that we can identify students to prevent spending more time addressing and reacting to problems down the road. Finally, with regard to usability, we should be concerned with treatment utility. And this refers to the extent to which a screening tool and the results yielded by the screening tool lead to beneficial outcomes for students. So if a screening tool has high treatment utility, it means that we can take the results from that screening and use it to inform or evaluate intervention. So the extent to which we can use the data to make decisions about students' intervention. All three of these considerations are important, and you should take some time to think about what is appropriate for your context and population, as well as how the data will be used. Hopefully you can see that there are some related considerations with regard to screening. The constructs that are assessed may also influence who we ask to complete the screening tool as an informant. And who we ask to complete the screening tool may influence the procedures that we use as part of the screening process. So for example, if we are concerned with internalizing problems, such as an anxiety or depression, those problems tend to be best reported by students themselves. So if we are interested in assessing internalizing problems, we may choose students as an optimal informant. And if we do so, that influences how we collect the data, because we have to put additional safeguards in place, given that we are asking students who are minors to fill out information. So we're asking them to give us personal information about their social emotional functioning and well-being. So we may have to alter our procedures in a way to make sure that we are protecting those students as informants. Conversely, if we're focusing on something like externalizing problems like aggression or conduct, the best informants for that may be teachers, or it may be a combination of teachers and support staff. With something like the systematic screening for behavior disorders, which I'll discuss later, we can use multiple informants, using the teacher as the first informant and using an external observer to gather additional information. We can make a more robust decision about both internalizing and externalizing problems. If we choose that method, then you can see that the procedures involved are more involved than just asking a teacher to serve as the lone informant. So consideration of the constructs your stakeholders want to assess, as well as the procedures involved and the optimal informant are all important considerations when selecting a particular screening approach. With regard to the constructs assessed specifically, there are a wide range of skills and behaviors that can be assessed through SEB screening. Some screening tools focus on problems that interfere with learning, like internalizing and externalizing problems. Others focus on strengths or social-emotional competence, things like empathy, self-awareness, social relationship skills. So these may be protective factors which buffer against problems happening down the road. There are also screening tools which focus more exclusively on just behaviors related to school success. So instead of assessing the full range of social skills, it may focus on social skills specific to the school context, things like active listening, conflict management, or communication, as well as behaviors that are exhibited in the classroom that directly impact learning, without spanning the full range of a child's social or emotional functioning. So these are all important considerations when thinking about what types of constructs you want to assess. Do you care about the problems? Do you care about the skills that you want to build? Or in some cases, do you care about both? It's you could make an argument that the best outcomes happen when a student has high social and emotional skills, as well as low levels of problem behavior. So it is possible that you may use more than one particular screening tool in a comprehensive screening approach. As we discussed with regard to the informant, what type of construct you are assessing may determine who serves as your optimal informant. For things like externalizing problems, teachers are often the best informants. However, they may require time to get to know students. It may take a couple months into the school year before you're ready to do screening using the teacher as the informant. With regard to parents as informants, parents have a much richer history of student functioning that they can contribute to when students enter school. So for example, in preschool screening, many times we include parents as the optimal informant because they have the background and the longitudinal perspective of the student's functioning upon school entry. One of the limitations of using parents as an informant is that we sometimes have low response rates. So it is possible that we may not get all of our parents to return or complete screening measures, which can influence the extent to which we're able to make school-wide decisions. If we use teachers as informants, we have a much higher probability of having everyone complete the measures. Finally, with regard to students as an informant, as I said, many times students are the best informant for reporting internalizing problems. However, one of the limitations is that many screening tools do not exist for young students in a self-report form. Students need to be able to understand the item content, understand their own functioning, and be able to report accurately and rate their own levels of functioning. Typically, self-report measures exist for students above age 8, depending on specific measures that may be even later, 11 to 12 years old. Finally, one of the limitations of a student report approach is that it may be influenced by social desirability bias. Students may be reluctant to identify the behaviors that are problematic for them, or they may report their responses in a way that makes them look better than they are actually functioning. So all of these are important to consider. There's no optimal informant. The informant depends on what it is that you want to assess, as well as the context of your environment. With regard to the screening procedures themselves, one of the most important things to consider is what systems and resources are needed to collect, store, and analyze the data. There are free social, emotional, and behavioral screening tools available, but one of the limitations of using the free tools is that you are responsible for managing the data yourself, typically in an Excel spreadsheet or in some other database form. Commercially available rating scales often have a data management system that comes along with the fee that you pay. So in some sense, you may want to spend money in order to save time managing and analyzing the data. If you can have a system that accompanies your screening tool that allows you to look at data quickly and make accurate decisions, that may be worth the money that you spend on it. Another thing to consider is, can data be used in ways that are compatible with your school's current school delivery model or service delivery model? For example, you may have a team in place that examines academic data. If you have team structures in place that can be leveraged to analyze social, emotional, and behavioral screening data, you're in a much better position to use the tool effectively. Additionally, can the data be used to inform intervention within your existing systems? So ideally, if you are going to conduct SEB screening, you should be able to connect the students who are identified through screening through 2 social, emotional, and behavioral supports. We don't want to identify students and then not be able to help them. So one of the things to consider is the extent to which your screening tool aligns with the interventions you have available. If students screen as at risk on a particular screening tool, can they be connected to targeted intervention? Or can they be connected to intensive intervention? So this is an important consideration to see how your screening tool and the constructs assessed and the data that are yielded map onto the existing supports that you have in place. Finally, another important consideration with regard to the procedures is the roles and responsibilities for school personnel. At the most basic level, we may ask teachers to complete screening measures for students in their class. At a more advanced level, we may ask teachers and school staff to participate in data analysis and implementing intervention connected to those data. So it depends the extent to which you plan to involve school staff and personnel in screening procedures may influence the type of screening tool that you use. So in the following slides, I will discuss some of the major screening approaches. Identified 4 main approaches to social, emotional, and behavioral screening. However, it's important to understand that some of these procedures may be used together. It's not as if you have to choose just one of these particular screening approaches. You may have multiple approaches that are integrated to give you a more comprehensive picture. It's also important to note that there is no best screening approach. This is not a one-size-fits-all approach to screening. There are screening tools that may be better for your particular context, and there may be screening procedures that more align with systems that you already have in place. So the screening approaches that I discussed in the following slides are intended to give you an idea of some of the examples of particular screening tools and approaches. It's not intended to give you a specific recommendation to use one particular tool over another. The first main screening approach is to use existing data sources. Typically, this is used as office discipline referrals. So with office discipline referrals, we have outlined school-wide expectations for student behavior, and we've also outlined and articulated violations of those behavior expectations. So we've articulated what constitutes a minor behavioral infraction, and we've articulated what constitutes a major behavioral infraction. With an ODR, we have a systematic process for recording those behavioral infractions, as well as additional information like where the problem occurred, with whom this problem occurred, what time of day it happened, and the possible antecedents and consequences that may be contributing to existence of this problem behavior. So with an ODR, we have a systematic process for recording and storing that information. Office discipline referrals are useful because they often align with our school-wide system of positive behavior supports. It also gives us a universal way to record and identify behaviors that may be problematic. Generally speaking, students who exhibit more than 2 ODR are at some risk for continuing to exhibit problems throughout the school year. 6 or more ODR in a school year may indicate a serious problem that warrants more intensive intervention. The PBISapps.org, the producers of the Swiss program of data management, have a term they call the October catch. So students exhibiting 2 or more ODR within the first couple of months of school are at continued risk for problems throughout the school year. So if we can use ODR to identify students who have 2 or more infractions in the first couple of months of school, we can connect those students with supports and provide proactive support. You can see that ODRs have a number of advantages as well as some limitations. One of the major advantages of ODR is that they are versatile and flexible. We can include a wide range of behaviors that we want to record on an ODR. We can create our own ODR to match our school expectations as well as the problems that we want to record. ODR also align with our service delivery in that they often align with teaching of behavioral expectations and record infractions that are not in line with those expectations. Quite a bit of research shows that ODRs are acceptable to school staff who fill them out, and ODR have the potential to have very high treatment utility because we can record a lot of contextual information around the behavior that helps us inform intervention. For example, we can identify in what setting a problem occurs. Is it the bathroom? Is it the cafeteria, the classroom? We can identify what time of day it is. Is it in a morning transition into school? Is it at lunch? Is it in the afternoon? And we can identify a potential function or what may be maintaining a particular problem behavior. So all of this information can be used to develop an intervention that has a high probability of success. Some of the limitations of ODR are that they are reactive, so that we have to wait for students to exhibit some type of problem before they get help. They have to exhibit at least 2 ODR or behavior problems over several occasions before we identify them to provide support. ODR also tend to focus on overt behavior, things like conduct, aggression. They tend not to be as sensitive to internalizing problems like anxiety and depression. And finally, ODR can be biased. Different school staff have different thresholds for what constitutes a major behavioral infraction. So it's possible that there may be some inconsistency with regard to the extent to which ODR are completed by particular staff, as well as the extent to which ODR are completed for groups of students. There is some research that shows that students of color tend to be identified through ODR more often than students who are white. So it's important to consider that there's a potential for bias here when we're using ODR, and that's one of the major limitations. The next major screening approach is using individual ratings. These individual ratings often take the form of brief individual rating scales. So they're brief in that they can include fewer items than comprehensive rating scales, but we typically complete a rating scale for each student in the class. These rating scales tend to be norm referenced, and they have some cutoff score to identify levels of risk. Some rating scales give you an overall one measure of risk. Others have subscales which can help pinpoint more specific areas of risk, like attention problems, externalizing problems, internalizing problems, or social skills. So these rating scales, the extent to which they have subscales may help you inform intervention. These individual rating scales vary widely in the constructs that they assess. Some assess exclusively strengths and competence, some assess problems or deficits, and some have a combination of the two. So again, you can see how the constructs that you wish to assess in some ways inform the screening approach or the screening tool that you select. In the next 2 slides, I've included a number of examples of some of the most commonly used individual rating scales used in SEB screening. Again, this is not intended to be an endorsement or a recommendation. I just want to give you an idea of the breadth and range of tools available. On this page, the BASC-3 Behavioral and Emotional Screening System, you can see that it has forms for 3 different informants. It also has forms for different age ranges. And it has numerous subscales to identify different areas that may help you inform intervention. The same is true with the BIMAS. So when you're thinking about which particular screening tool to use, it may be more advantageous if there are the possibility to use multiple informants and have multiple scales which may help you inform intervention. Both the BASC-3 BESS and the BIMAS assess both problems as well as a couple pro-social skills, or adaptive skills. So with the BESS adaptive skills index, with the BIMAS social functioning and academic functioning. So there's a combination of deficits and strengths built into both of these screening tools. The emotional behavioral screener focuses exclusively on behaviors that would constitute problems. Conversely, the DESA Mini focuses exclusively on social emotional competence or strengths. Continued on this page, we have some more screening tools. What's unique about two of these screening tools is that they're available for free. So the Strengths and Difficulties questionnaire has the possibility to use multiple informants across multiple age ranges, and it gives you 5 different scales that can help you inform intervention: emotional symptoms, conduct problems, hyperactivity and attention, peer relations problem, and then a reverse scored or adaptive pro-social behavior scale. So again, it combines strengths and challenges. The same is true with this first screening tool, the SABRES. The SABRES assesses strengths in terms of social behavior and academic behavior, and also problems related to emotional behavior. Finally, the Student Risk Screening Scale focuses on traditionally externalizing problems, but there's a more recent version that includes items related to externalizing as well as items related to internalizing problems. So the SDQ, or Strengths and Difficulties Questionnaire, and the SRSS, the Student Risk Screening Scale, are both available to use for free. You can access them and use these screening tools. The problem or the drawback is that you have to manage the data yourself. So things like the SABRES, the BIMAS, they have a data management system that comes along with the fee that you pay to use the tool. So again, considering not just the screening tool itself with regard to technical adequacy and appropriateness, but also the usability, the extent to which it's feasible and the data can be turned into action or intervention. This is just one example of the Student Risk Screening Scale. I give you this example because it's slightly different than some of the other screening tools. The majority of individual ratings use one form per student, so that I fill out a brief rating scale for each student in a particular class. What's unique about the SRSS is that we sort of simultaneously fill out ratings for all students in a matrix format. So if I list my class roster down the left column, and then the items are listed across the top, I provide a rating for each student on my class roster for each one of these particular behaviors. And I come up with a total score, and that total score indicates risk. So it still involves individual ratings, but it's done in a more efficient way in which I can rate all of the students quickly without using a separate form for each student. So again, it's not just the screening tool and the technical adequacy of the screening tool, it's also how it's usable. This particular method tends to be more feasible because it can be done with less time. With regard to these individual ratings, one of the main advantages is that these individual ratings use multiple constructs. So these individual rating scales can assess a wide range of constructs depending on what your school community is interested in. You may focus on strengths, problems. The subscores inherent in these rating scales help you target intervention towards more specific problems. Another advantage of using these individual ratings is that you assess all students. So if you fill out a rating scale for every single student in your classroom, you are ensuring that you're covering every student and assessing their social-emotional skills or behavior. There is an option to use a more multiple gated approach, which we'll talk about later, in which you take a nominated group of students and you only fill out rating scales for those students. However, you lose the universal nature of this particular method. Many of these screening tools are norm referenced, so they compare the functioning of a student to other students his or her or their age. This can help you quantify the severity of a particular problem with regard to what is expected for that developmental age. One of the main strengths of these individual ratings is that they have strong evidence of reliability and validity. They have been well researched and validated, and they tend to be robust in terms of the psychometric properties of the scales. Some of these individual ratings use a brief format in which you fill out a brief scale for students. And then based on those scores, it's linked to a more comprehensive, in-depth rating scale or assessment. For example, the DESA Mini has 8 items that focus on social emotional competence. But then if a student is identified as at risk, you can fill out a more comprehensive 72-item DESA form, which gives you subscales and more specific areas to target through intervention. The limitations of these particular individual ratings are that they may be inefficient. If you think about the time required to fill out a rating form for each student in the class and do that 3 times a year, it can be a significant burden on teachers, particularly as the number of items increase. If you think about the number of items on some of these rating scales, 20 or more items times 25 students in the class times 3 times a year, you can spend a lot of time asking teachers to complete the screening procedures itself. Additionally, many of these rating scales will give you scores or risk levels, but it's not always clear how they link to intervention. One of the limitations is that intervention connection is not always clear. Additionally, one of the major limitations of the commercially available rating scales is the cost. For some paper-based rating forms, you have to pay for a form per student per screening period. So this cost of this adds up quickly. One of the ways in which screening systems have improved upon this is to use an electronic system of data management and charge just a per student fee across the whole year. So this cuts down on some of the costs, but you still have to pay a per student cost to use the particular screening tool. However, as I said, there are 2 screening tools, the SDQ and the SRSS, which can be available for free. However, the limitation is you have to manage the data yourself. The next major screening approach involves evaluating all students on common criteria. And I'm going to give you one particular example of this. The Social Skills Improvement System Social Emotional Learning Edition is the most recent version of the SSIS screening tool. This is a criterion reference tool, meaning that teachers are given descriptions of student behaviors at various levels. The teacher then identifies the level at which the student is most accurately functioning. And I'll show you an example of that in a minute. With the SSIS SEL, there are 8 skill areas. There are 5 skill areas that align with the Collaborative for Social Emotional Assessment, or CASEL framework. And those are self-awareness, self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and responsible decision-making. So you have one form or one scale for each of these skill areas. You also have a form or scale for motivation to learn, reading skills, and mathematical skills. So you have a wide range of social functioning as well as some academic skills, which is an indirect assessment of academic skills, but it allows you to assess broad areas of functioning. The age range for this SSIS SEL is from 4 to 14. This is an example of one of the scales within the SSIS SEL. The relationship skills domain assesses how students interact with others. When a teacher completes this particular screening tool in this area, the teacher lists the student roster, or has a student roster of all students in the class, represented by this column on the right. Then the teacher goes down the class roster and rates students in terms of at which level of functioning that particular student falls. To do this, the teacher refers to a criterion reference guide for that particular area. So for relationship skills, a student who is functioning at a level 5 has exceptional communication and cooperation skills and exceptional or excellent self-control and ability to resist peer pressure. Conversely, a student who's functioning at a high risk level or at a 1 level has very few communication and cooperation skills, and has very limited self-control and ability to resist peer pressure. For the sake of test security and to protect the copyright, I did not include all of the items on this particular domain. I've only included 2 indicators here. There are more indicators within each level in each domain. But I did this for the purposes of learning so that you can see an example of what some of those indicators are. The idea is that the teacher selects the most appropriate level of functioning for a particular student and then indicates that on some summary sheet. Based on the results of that, you can identify which students are at risk in a particular area and then direct intervention for those students in that particular area. So one of the main strengths of this is that it allows you to do this very efficiently. You can screen an entire class in relatively short amount of time, particularly once you have an understanding of the various, what constitutes functioning at each level within each domain. After you have some practice understanding that, the screening process can be much more efficient. One of the main advantages of this approach is that it allows you to assess multiple constructs. So we have 5 domains of social emotional functioning, but we also have 3 domains related to academic performance. It's also strength focused. So it focuses on skills that we want to build within a student. If a student is functioning at a lower level on one of these areas, we can provide intervention to improve the student's functioning in that area. As I said, these tend to be very efficient in that you can screen an entire class in a relatively short amount of time. They also, this particular measure in particular, the SSIS, has high treatment utility because it is specifically linked to an intervention program. So using the screening results to identify which students need instruction in which areas of social emotional functioning, you can turn that information directly into intervention by selecting appropriate lessons and skill areas within the intervention program to align with your screening results. So it facilitates intervention and has a high potential for treatment utility. Some of the limitations of this particular method is that it may not assess problems. The SSIS in particular doesn't tap things that may interfere with learning, things like depression, anxiety, or internalizing problems. So if you're interested in assessing not just strengths or skills, but also the problems that may interfere, you might have to combine this with another method. The cost can sometimes be prohibitive when you think about you have to use a form for each classroom, for each screening period, and it has to be across multiple domains. There is an option for using an electronic version, which can help you cut down on some of that cost. Finally, because these are criterion referenced measures, it does not allow us to compare students in my particular class and their functioning to what would be expected for another student that age. So it gives us some challenge in identifying or quantifying the exact severity of problems or the exact severity of skill deficits. So it's useful for informing intervention, focusing on what skills we need to help target with these students, but it doesn't necessarily give us comparison of students within my class to students of the same age. The last screening approach that I'll discuss is called the multiple gating. Multiple gating procedures involve multiple steps or gates. And in each step, there are fewer and fewer number of students who are involved in that particular gate or phase. The most famous approach that falls within this multiple gating category is what's known as the systematic screening for behavior disorders, or the SSBD. The SSBD involves several stages or gates, each involving a different method. And that method then, how a student performs or the outcomes on that particular method indicate whether the student passes on to the subsequent gate. For example, in the SSBD, a teacher starts out by nominating 10 students who exhibit internalizing problems and 10 students who exhibit externalizing problems. Then the top 3 students pass on to the next phase, in which the teacher fills out ratings for those 6 students. Based on whether or not students exceed certain criteria on those measures, observations are done for those students. And then based on the results of those observations, the team makes decisions about what the student needs, whether it be targeted intervention, referral to a student support team, or referral for a more comprehensive evaluation. So at the first gate of the SSBD, to be more specific, as I said, the teacher starts by nominating 10 students who exhibit patterns of behavior that align with internalizing problems and 10 students who exhibit patterns of behavior that align with externalizing problems. And there are some examples here. These lists are mutually exclusive. So if a teacher nominates a student for internalizing problems, that student is not included on the list for externalizing problems. The top 3 rated students on this first nomination list are passed through into the next gate, pass through this first gate into the next phase, in which the teacher completes specific measures for those students. It is possible for a teacher to pass through more than 3 students on each list. So if there's a student that a teacher is particularly concerned about, but that student is ranked number 4, that student can be passed through the first gate and the teacher can complete measures on that particular student. So you can see some of the limitations of this particular phase is that there's a certain comorbidity that often happens between students who exhibit internalizing and externalizing problems. So a student is included as having one versus the other. We don't have an option for including students who exhibit both. We also have a limitation with regard to the number of students for whom we complete the measures in phase 2. We can pass through additional students, but the more students we pass through this first gate into the next phase, the more time the teacher has to spend on completing those measures. So for the top 3 students on each list of internalizing and externalizing problems in phase 1, they pass through that first gate into phase 2, in which the teacher completes a critical events index, which is a checklist of low frequency, high intensity behaviors, things like fire setting, cruelty to animals. These are behaviors that if a teacher indicates they're present, indicate high risk or severe behavior that warrants attention. So the teacher fills out this critical events index for each student that has passed through the first gate into this phase. The teacher also fills out something called the combined frequency index for each student, which is a more traditional rating scale that includes 12 items related to adaptive behavior and 11 items related to maladaptive behavior. Overall, the teacher is rating how often these behaviors have been exhibited by the student in the past month. So the teacher fills out both of these measures for each student who's passed into this phase. Then, based on criteria on both of these measures, which I won't get into the specific details right now, but if a student meets criteria on these measures, then that student passes through this gate into the next phase. So it's possible that not all students for whom the teacher has completed these measures will continue through the screening process. One of the advantages, though, is that you can see that these procedures are more time consuming for a teacher to fill out a rating scale and a checklist for each student. The advantage is that the teacher is only doing that for a small number of students who've passed through that first gate. Typically, it's only 6 students, but it could be more. For those students who exceed the criteria on those 2 measures in the second phase, and an external observer observes each student twice in the classroom and twice on the playground. The observer records continuous engaged time. So using a stopwatch, the observer records when a student is engaged, stops the watch when the student becomes disengaged, and restarts when the student's engaged again. We have a continuous recording of engaged time. The external observer also uses a partial interval recording procedure to record peer social behaviors, specifically social engagement, participation, parallel play, and alone. There's also a no codable response when the student is not exhibiting one of these particular categories of behavior. The advantage of this is that you have an external observer, someone other than the teacher, has a chance to observe a student, see the behaviors in the context in which they occur, and use a systematic process for recording data on those particular behaviors. Based on the criteria from this phase, students who pass through this gate are determined to be at high risk for social and behavior disorders, and those students warrant intervention. So it's possible that students may pass through the first gate and the second gate and get to this observation phase. When the external observer observes these students, that observer determines that the student is not exhibiting behaviors that reach the threshold for concern. So you can see that there are numerous advantages to this particular screening approach. In a multiple gating process, we have multiple methods. We start with teacher nomination. We move to norm-referenced rating scales and checklists. Then we move to systematic direct observation in the third phase. So we have multiple methods of assessment built in to one particular screening process. We also have multiple informants. We start with the teacher nominating students, and the teacher completing measures for each student. But then we also have an external observer conducting the observations of the student in the classroom and on the playground. So the standards for having a robust multi-method, multi-informant assessment are built into one screening process, and that's a huge advantage of the SSBD. Because of that, there is strong evidence for the reliability and validity of the SSBD and multiple gating procedures. Multiple gating procedures can be efficient. Now, even though this overall process takes a lot of time and resources, from the teacher perspective, if you think about the screening procedures involved, the teacher at the first stage is just nominating students based on descriptions of what constitutes internalizing and externalizing behavior. In the second phase, the teacher is only filling out these two measures, the critical events index and the combined frequency index rating scale, for a small number of students in the class. Typically, only 6 students are rated by the teacher on these two measures. So from a teacher's perspective, gates 1 and 2, or phases 1 and 2, can take about an hour and a half per screening period. So that's actually pretty efficient when you compare it to a teacher filling out a 25-item rating scale for 25 students. The most time-consuming procedures, systematic direct observation in the third phase, are used with a small and fewer and fewer students who pass through gates 1 and 2. Some of the limitations with regard to the SSBD: it requires substantial training, particularly for the observer to conduct the observations in the third phase, but also for the teacher to recognize what constitutes internalizing problems and externalizing problems in the first phase, and then nominate students based on those descriptions. The SSBD assesses internalizing and externalizing problems, and students who are nominated on one list are not included on another list. So that's a major limitation, in that it doesn't allow for the assessment of comorbid problems. The SSBD overall, the full procedure, does require substantial resources because it requires an external observer to observe all of these students. It is possible that if we follow the procedures to a T, an external observer could be conducting 4 observations for 6 students in each class. If a lot of students are passing through to the 3rd phase, then the observer will spend a lot of time conducting these observations. The efficiency thus decreases as the number of students who pass through gates 1 and 2 increases. So the more students who pass through those early gates, the more time we have to spend in the later phases of this particular assessment. So many people consider the SSBD to be the gold standard for screening. You can see because it uses multiple methods and multiple informants, it's a robust, technically sound method. One of the considerations is the extent to which your particular school context will be able to carry out the procedures necessary to do this as intended. So that constitutes the overview of various screening approaches available to you to assess students' social, emotional skills, and behavior. There's a number of resources here which may help you. These are general resources related to social emotional screening. In particular, the Glover and Albers article gives you a good overview of the considerations for evaluating screening tools, including the appropriateness of the screening tool, the technical adequacy, and the usability, which is a key, often overlooked component of evaluating these particular screening approaches. These particular screening tools that I mentioned for each method are included in these next 2 reference slides. You can find more information about these from the publishers of these particular measures, as well as research available to you that evaluates some of the properties of these particular measures. So the emotional and behavioral screener, the student risk screening scale, the SSIS, SEL edition, the strength and difficulties questionnaire, student risk screening scale for internalizing, externalizing. This website in particular, Lane Menzies, and the CI3T.org website can give you an overview of this particular screening tool as well as some other screening tools. The BIMAS by McDougall, Bardos, and Meyer. The DESA Mini by Neglieri, LaBeouf, and Shapiro. The BASC3 BESS by Reynolds and Camphouse. And then the next 3 relate to the SSBD and a downward extension of the SSBD known as the Early Screening Project, which is a multiple gating procedure for students in preschool, ages 3 to 5. There's a more recent version, a version 2nd edition of the SSBD, which was published by Walker, Severson, and Fiel. So these resources are available to you. I encourage you to examine them in more detail. But as I said, there is no ideal screening tool. There's no one-size-fits-all approach. It requires consideration of what's appropriate for your context and what's usable, feasible, acceptable, and leads to intervention within your particular context. So if you have questions about anything covered in this particular module, I'd be happy to answer them. I can be reached at briandaniels@umb.edu. Social emotional screening is one of my main areas of research, and I love to talk about it. So I'd love to hear from you if you're interested. You can also contact the project director for the Birch Project, Catherine Kurtz, and her email is birch.project@umb.edu. So thank you very much. I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you.